Hello everyone, welcome to our 12th Climate Clinic. This one is titled A Violent Horizon, Conflict Internationally and the Climate Crisis. And we aim to look at conflict, I guess, through a variety of lenses, at a variety of scales, and how the climate crisis is kind of intersects with those. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So, content. What will we be talking about in today's climate clinic? We'll be talking about civil war and how the climate crisis has impacted on lots of civil conflicts around the world. We'll look at interpersonal violence, especially violence against women, and how that intersects with the climate crisis. And we'll also look at international war and potential projections with regards to how that might intersect with the climate crisis. So I've got a little chart here you can see, and I just kind of highlighted some key ideas which we'll be discussing during the climate clinic, ranging from sea level changes, migration and refugees, how increasing land and ocean temperatures might affect food supply and biodiversity, and essentially how increasing extreme weather events can lead to exacerbation of lots of these problems. And also we'll be looking at climate resilience and getting more familiar with that term if we're not already familiar with it. So we'll start off by looking at civil war. So this is a case study and some anecdotal observations, this section. So the climate crisis is a risk multiplier. This is a key idea to take away. The climate crisis doesn't cause civil war, and changes in rainfall don't cause people to fight each other, but it's a multiplier. What it does is it takes existing risks and it makes them more severe than they would have been otherwise. And so over a scale of an entire world with millions of complex societies and interactions going on, when you multiply that risk over the whole population, it doesn't mean violence will happen in a certain place at a certain time, but it increases the likelihood that it will occur. And that has human consequences in terms of, the millions of people that are affected. So climate sensitivity and resilience and how that's implied with civil war. So this is an Imperial College study that I found, and it links the Syrian civil war, which is still ongoing, and it's been going on for about 10 years now. It's linked to a really massive drought, 2007 to 2010. And it certainly was a contributing factor to the current conflict, which has displaced, I think it's 10 to 13 million people, a majority of them internally, but they're still displaced. And we'll look later on how that has implications, not just at the wide level for how it makes people, more insecure in their situations and more likely for violence to occur at a wide level, but also between individuals, why violence is increased as a result of those more tenuous conditions. So you can see the quote there, but essentially the drought that happened, it was 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of existing climate change that's already occurred. And we know in the future it's not exponential, but we know that there's a dramatic increase in that factor as time goes on. And so we'll in the future be seeing droughts becoming 6 to 7 times more likely, 14 to 15 times more likely than they would have been. And that has implications for these regions which have existing risk factors. So climate resilience and stability changes. So I need to zoom out a little bit if I can. Maybe I can't. There's so much that zooms out clearly. Well, we can look at climate resilience as essentially it's the built architecture, it's the food security, the supply chain for food and the diversity of foodstuffs that might be consumed in a society. It's to do with how resources are distributed within a society. Is it trickle down, or is it through a distribution where everyone has a tiny amount of land they own? All of those factors impact on how resilient a culture will be to challenges that are posed, especially through extreme weather events, which climate change is making more common. So the challenge could be coronavirus, but weather event challenges are becoming increasingly common and severe. So what's the difference between a society that overcomes a challenge or a society that falls from a challenge? I haven't put collapsed because often challenges won't cause a collapse, but they'll make things a bit worse. And over time, multiple challenge events combined can lead to a wider failing of that society to stay cohesive. So society overcomes the challenge when you have strong governance, lower severity weather events, and high climate resilience. So you have built architecture that's designed for a range of conditions, houses that are well built that won't fall down when there's a storm, infrastructure for transporting food that is really resilient to flooding, and those kind of things. That's what high climate resilience would look like. A society will fall from a challenge often when you have weaker governance, which means that there's less of a response when high severity weather events occur, because that's also the more severe the event, the more likely it is that it will overcome the society's ability to absorb that shock, and also low climate resilience. So if you have very inappropriate existing infrastructure for future climate and stuff, for example, if you built a lot of your housing and business and industry in coastal regions that are likely to flood in the future, which is what we're currently doing in the UK. I think 14% of new builds are built in areas that will be flooded by 2100 or 2150. So it's kind of stupid that we're doing that. And that certainly is a low climate resilience system that we're building, because we will suffer in the future, and we know that almost as an inevitability at this point. And so it seems like we would want to be building more resilience into our system than we have currently. So, civil wars and climate sensitivity. So this is anecdotal, and it's something I noticed while I was teaching geography, which I do on the side, as well as studying medicine. I teach geography, and so I was teaching a student about the Sahel, which is a region, a semi-arid region, just bordering the Sahara here, and you can see the rainfall is very seasonal but very variable. It's towards kind of, I guess, the lower end of the global spectrum, and it means that if you have a drought for 1 year, it has a really big impact compared to if you had a drought in another part of the world, on people being able to meet their physical water needs. So we also, if we overlay a map of some of the largest civil conflicts currently ongoing in the world, there's a lot more than I've just picked out here anecdotally, but I've highlighted, I should have highlighted Darfur in Sudan, which is about here, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, the Syrian civil war in the Fertile Crescent, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Yemeni civil war currently ongoing, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. These are all regions which are, for the most part, we describe as arid to semi-arid, and certainly you'd say they were highly climate sensitive. A drought for 1 year has a really big impact in a place with very low rainfall anyway, than it does in an area where rainfall is a lot higher usually. So, and I'm not saying that these conflicts were caused by climate change, but what I'm trying to say is that the climate crisis is a risk multiplier. And you can almost look at this map and see the red zones as areas which are highly climate sensitive, but increasingly as we move towards more unstable future climatically, more regions of this map that are currently kind of in that green zone, in that yellowy zone, the risks are multiplying in those regions as well. At the moment, the risk multiplier is worst for those red regions, but it will increase. And this is just from the perspective of precipitation, which is like rainfall. Climate change affects multiple things beyond rainfall, but just from a rainfall perspective, we can begin to see there's regions of the world that in the future might have increased risk multiplier because of climate problems. I hope you know what I'm trying to say. It's getting a bit academic. So, some statistics. The 2020 World Migration Report reported that in 2018, 28 million people were displaced. That number is expected to rise to about 200 million by 2050. The estimates range between 25 million and 1 billion. It's an incredibly variable figure depending on which research paper you're reading, and it's very hard to find a statistic which is accurate because it's incredibly variable depending on how we react to the climate crisis, how much we build resiliency into our systems, how governance will look in the future. All of those things impact on the number of future displaced people. But at the moment, the takeaway figure that averages out from all of those is about 200 million. So almost a factor of 10 more than we currently have today. 61% of those displacements were caused by disasters. And we know that those, especially extreme weather events, they're increasing in number and severity, which will likely increase the number of displaced people in the future. And that proportion will increase as more and more people are displaced by that. The other breakdown was that 39% of displacements are linked to war and conflict. However, as we've just discovered, war and conflict are partially caused by these extreme weather events, which in themselves are challenges to stability. And so actually that 39%, not entirely, but at least part of that is attributable to climate. It gets very difficult because we're working with very abstract numbers here. But already we're seeing a huge amount of displacement around the world and poverty as a result of the climate crisis. And that really will increase in a dramatic way if we don't build more climate resilient systems. And because we're not at the moment, without using the word if, we won't be living in a future with just 28 million displaced in 30 years' time. We will be living in a more violent and insecure system if we don't change. And I'm using the word if lightly here because I think that term is often used to make people feel better, but actually the reality is we're not actually using that if clause. We're saying it, but we're not doing anything. So we're not doing a lot to the scale that we need to be doing, in my opinion. Interpersonal violence, violence against women, and the climate crisis. So on a more individual level, how is the climate crisis interplaying into violent situations? So we know that there's a relationship between material poverty, weak governance / distributive facets in a society, and interpersonal conflict and or violence. And two of these things, the material poverty and weak governance, both of them are made worse by climate / weather / disaster event forcings. So when you have a typhoon or flooding or drought, they increase material poverty and increase weak governance often, and that can lead to increased interpersonal conflicts. So the climate crisis doesn't make people more violent necessarily, but what it does do is it increases the risk of violence by increasing directly some other aspects of life and society. This is a quote from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. In the most comprehensive study of its kind, more than 1,000 sources were analysed, and they found extensive direct links between environmental pressures and gender-based violence. So this is when we begin to hone in not just on interpersonal violence, but especially violence against women. So violence against women, when we're looking at the climate crisis and who it affects, women are disproportionately displaced in these extreme weather events, often with children. And so for example, in some other places, the Democratic Republic of Congo, logging and charcoal trade and mining, these extractive industries are linked to sexual exploitation. But additionally, after extreme weather events, in these difficult times, sexual trafficking increases and young girls are married off, is what this data is suggesting. I've got all my sources at the end. But essentially, when times get tough, women are not afforded the autonomy that they should be. That's what the research is suggesting for lots of societies around the world, not necessarily in the UK, but in lots of other societies. So there is a bit more to this, but we haven't got time to cover it, unfortunately. I only have 15 minutes to do each climate clinic. So it's international war and the climate crisis, and just here's some things to look at and have a read of. You can pause it now. I haven't got time to go over it. And I also don't have any questions for today. I ran out of time. Have a look here at the bibliography if you want. I hope you enjoyed today's climate clinic, and certainly there was a lot more opinion than there is in a normal climate clinic, so feel free to rant away in the comments.